everybody. Welcome to Beyond the Silence, the podcast that delves into the untold stories and lasting impact of the historical tragedies. I'm your host, Sanja Njakic, and today, in this third episode, we have a distinguished guest joining us. Uh, Today, we have Alexandra Stiglmayer as our guest. Alexandra Stiglmayer was one of the reporters who interviewed survivors of the during the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, especially the rape victims, where she, through her reporting, told their stories, the horrors of the mass rape. The woman endured in these atrocities of rape and the loss of the loved ones. Their testimony was published in a book which is called Mass Rape: The War Against the Woman in Bosnia and Herzegovina. A bare, direct, and cumulative, overwhelming story. Alexandra, welcome to Beyond the Silence.
Hi, Sanyin, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Before we jump into the topic, could you give us a short introduction of yourself? I know that you have been a very prominent reporter during the war. I also know that you have been working at the High Representative Office in Bosnia, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So please, if you could give us a short introduction of you.
So I grew up in Germany. I studied journalism and became a journalist working for media in Germany. But I was, or still am, of Croatian origin. And when the war in Yugoslavia started, I was very interested to see what was going on there, because I knew Yugoslavia from summer holidays, and I had never imagined that people that I met at the coast, and they were from all the republics of Yugoslavia, would suddenly start to fight each other. So I first did 2 internships, and that was in 92. And then I stayed because the war in Bosnia was starting. And I thought that there would be interest from Western media, German media. And I also wanted to see for myself. So basically, I covered the war. I first worked as a freelance journalist for German media, then soon also American media, also Danish and other media in English. And then I became a reporter for Time magazine. And then later on, I was reposted to Berlin in 96, but it was such a kind of big change to what I had experienced in Bosnia, and I missed Bosnia. So in 98, I went back and started working for the Office of the High Representative, which is implementing the Dayton Peace Agreement in Bosnia. And then later on again, I met my husband of today. We decided to move to Brussels. I started working for the European Commission. Then I worked for a think tank that's dealing also a lot with Western Balkan countries for 15 years. And 2 years ago, I rejoined the European Commission.
Okay, a really great career that you have behind you with a lot of achievements. So could you, going back into time, can you share with us your personal experience as a young reporter during the war in Bosnia and how it influenced you and your perspective on the conflict as such?
I was very soon shocked by the suffering that the war inflicted on ordinary people, because I worked mainly in the areas of Bosnia and Herzegovina that were under the control of the Bosniaks and Croats. So a lot of people that were, as one says, ethnically cleansed by the Serbian forces went there. I also worked in Croatia partly. So I met many, many refugees and people who were just expelled and who told really horrible stories about what they had experienced, the torture, the brutality, the killing, and everything else that went with it. And I was just shocked that people could inflict such suffering on each other, and I didn't understand it. And I tried to understand it, which mechanisms work in these people. And I did find explanations for myself, but this shock of this terrible suffering, that was, I think, my main emotion.
Yeah. What kept you going? Because this was really a tough topic, mass rape in a war zone. So how did the stories came to be, and how did you how did the book at the end come to be?
Yeah. I mean, what kept me going was the general situation where, in my mind and in the mind of most journalists at the time there, it was clear that there was an aggression by Bosnian Serb forces with the full support of the Yugoslav army and against victims that didn't have the means to protect themselves. And I was hoping that the world international community would realize that and come to the help of the victims. So what kept me going was to the desire to show what was going on and to hope that politicians in the West would see that and finally decide to intervene. Now, rape was one of the things that was committed against mainly Bosniaks, but also to some extent Croatian and Serbian women. And it came about, I mean, it came about just almost by coincidence at the beginning, because one of the newspapers in Germany that I was working for had picked up a news agency's story about rape in Bosnia, and they asked me to look into it. And at the time, I was actually in Croatia, so I asked around the Bosnian community there because Croatia was hosting a lot of refugees from Bosnia. I also spoke to doctors and women's organization and tried to speak to one woman who was in hospital at the time, but she was a victim, a survivor of rape, and didn't have the strength to see me. But other people who knew her told me about her fate. And then I wrote an article for this German newspaper. And then a lot of other newspapers for which I worked saw it and said, we want to know more. What's going on? This seems to be like a widespread phenomenon. And then I went to Bosnia itself with a friend for like 2-3 months. That was early 93. And we just went from refugee camp to refugee camp and asked people if they knew victims of sexual violence. Everybody knew them, but very often the women and also girls were not willing to speak to anyone because they were too traumatized. But slowly we did manage to speak to some women, and a picture formed. And this picture showed that rape was part of the ethnic cleansing campaign. So I don't know if the commanders ordered the soldiers to rape, which I don't think, but I think they conveyed to them that it was okay because everything was okay that would drive away the Bosniaks or Croats that they wanted to expel. So torture was like, okay, looting, burning the houses, and rape was very okay because it really humiliated the whole community and also in a sense made sure that people wouldn't come back because they were too traumatized by the experience.
Exactly. And at this point, so when we look at the Hague Tribunal, 84, what was it, 48% of the cases that were raised were in relations to rape. But how, so we can definitely see a pattern from a historical point of view, but how was the media reaction at that point in time when you started sending your stories out to the world?
I mean, the media were very interested. I mean, I wrote stories for really, like, I don't know, Time magazine, News magazine, Miss magazine, Stern in Germany, all sorts of newspapers in Germany. But I mean, at the time, I thought that this was good, so people would learn about what's going on in Bosnia. But in some media, it also has a slightly sensationalist and voyeuristic aspect, which I didn't like. I mean, I didn't want that this becomes just like a gruesome story that people liked reading because it gave them goose pimples. I mean, my objective was really to report on all the terrible things that were happening in Bosnia in the hope to reach the political elites in the West and get them to intervene. So some of the stories, not my stories, but there were stories which were exaggerated. Now, what I think was good, the War Crimes Tribunal for Yugoslavia was very interested in the story. And I think already at the end of 93, I mean, before they had started working properly, they contacted me and I supplied them with all the interview transcripts I had. And I hope that some of them contributed to the prosecution of rapists. I mean, I know that some of the rapists that I had heard about in the accounts of women that I interviewed were really convicted, but I don't know what contributed to that. But I think that ICTY did a big step in prosecuting rape as a war crime in itself. I mean, rape was also prosecuted in Nuremberg and before, but it was always an add-on. I mean, the main indictments were about something else, and then there was like a small addition, and he raped, or he did this, or he committed crimes of sexual violence, but it was never prosecuted as a crime itself. ICTY was the first one to do that. And then after ICTY, many other war crimes tribunals followed suit.
Exactly. Looking at the coverage of these stories, especially in the English-speaking world, I was really trying to find somebody similar to you in regards of doing the work that you have been done, but I have not been able to find anybody to that really was on the field at that point in time covering these kinds of stories. Um, do you feel, looking back today, that these women have that justice has been served for these women who have been victims of rape?
No, justice has not been served because, of course, not all the rapists, or actually very few, have been convicted. And the women have not found the support system that they would have needed. I mean, Bosnia is a poor country. It doesn't have many resources, so one cannot expect too much. But I do think that the women have been left alone largely, which is very depressing. Because after the war, I was in touch with some women's groups, that kind of associations of women who had experienced violence, and the support they got from the state was very limited.
Yes, it for sure was not only the state but also the international community as such at that point in time, but also later. One of the things that I would actually ask you about is about how did these stories impacted you. I have your book on my desk. I have read it a couple of times, and one of the things that, to be very honest with you, um, I got all shivery when reading some of the stories, like the story from Ternopil, where a 17-year-old girl was taken away from her home and raped in the woods, which was more or less the start and the go for something that was classified as mass rape. How did these stories affect you? You were more or less on a daily basis in contact with these victims of mass rape.
It was difficult, which I kind of, I think, realized only later. I mean, some interviews were really touching, and both I and the woman or girl I was interviewing were just like crying the whole time. In that, of course, I also had to kind of be sure that they were telling the truth. I mean, it sounds terrible, but I wanted to make sure that it's not kind of a story somebody invents out of revenge because other horrible things happened. And then they tell a story, oh, yeah, and they raped me. But I really wanted to be sure that what the girl or the woman was saying was true. So you ask follow-up questions, or you ask like little questions and say, so you ask like, what was the perpetrator wearing? And they say he had the uniform. And then you ask later, oh, by the way, I just forgot was he wearing, just to make sure that the answer is the
Yeah,
same. Because if people make up things, they forget what they made up. But some of the stories were really touching. I mean, one of the really most terrible story was from a 17-year-old girl, which in the book I called Muniba. And she was taken to a hotel in Visegrad together with her younger sister and a friend. And then they were separated and presumably all raped. I mean, Muniba was. And she was let go after a while, but her little sister, 15-year-old, never came back. And she felt so guilty for it and has never gotten over it, because I visited the family later. They moved to Sarajevo and I saw them. And the mom said that her daughter was in psychological help, but she had this survivor's guilt. Like, I have survived, my little sister, for whom I was responsible, has not. But the way in which she told the story was really terrible. I mean, everybody in the room was crying. It was me, a colleague, the mom of Muniba, and like it was really, really horrible.
yeah. I can really imagine. I have read these stories, and they're really rough.
Yeah,
One,
and yeah,
yes,
and what I wanted to say. So at the time, I kind of, yes, I was depressed on these days, or for a few days later. But what I kind of noticed after finishing the book, I just needed 2 months off. And even when people started telling me about the Bosnian War, or tried to follow the news, I really got stomach ache. And I just said, like, I can't hear about this war anymore. I can't hear about all these terrible things. I just need some time out, which showed me that it had affected me more than I thought at the time.
yeah, and it truly does. When you read the stories, it affects you also from this perspective. Um,
Yeah.
you mentioned Visegrad, and before this interview, I was actually looking at some of the rape camps in Visegrad. One of them being this hotel at that point in time, but also today called Villina Vlas.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, that was where Muniba was taken to.
yeah, and what's really puzzling me today is looking at this hotel. It's actually a spa now. So you have a rape camp that is currently being used as a spa and wellness resort. How do you reflect that going on vacation with having that in mind? Um,
I mean, I don't know if people who go there know that. I mean, I find it disgusting. I mean, I don't know if any normal person would go to such a place knowing what it used to be. I think this hotel, I mean, in an ideal world, it would have been made into a museum and on what happened, to remind people of what happened, with plugs for everybody who lost their lives and the story what was done in the hotel. But this is not the case, of course.
No, unfortunately not. And I could see that, I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, that there was a gathering in Foča as well, where the victims were putting roses into the Drina River to remembrance of the rape victims.
Yeah.
Um, one of the questions that I know that your book is looking at the war against the woman based on these mass rapes. Were there cases where there were male rapes in these war times? Have you documented any of those kind?
I haven't. I mean, I have heard that there were such cases, but I've also read reports from doctors who have written about it because they treated the victims. But I think for men, it might have been even more difficult to talk about it, especially to a woman.
Yeah.
I mean, it was also very difficult for women. And I know of, I mean, women that I interviewed told me, like, please, I will tell you the story, but I don't want that you publish it with anything that could identify me, because I want to continue living in this community without being marked a raped woman. And I think for men, it was probably even more so the case, because at the time, Bosnia was a very patriarchal society. So I didn't even try to find the man, because it was kind of, I mean, it was in the 90s, the times were different. I don't think that men would have talked about it.
Yeah, and I agree. I also, the reason why I'm asking is because I read an interview about it, and the male who was actually telling the story was also using a name which was not his to cover his identity. But it's actually it puzzles me that what you're saying, because the exact same thing Roy Goodman also said to me a few weeks back. Would you classify this as an act of, now that we are in a situation where we can see a pattern from Foča to Visegrad to Prijedor, would you classify these happenings as an act of genocide?
I think they definitely contributed to genocide. But I mean, the definition of genocide requires that the acts committed are committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or part, a community or a group. So I think, together with everything else that was done, it was an attempt at genocide, but rape alone wasn't maybe necessarily enough. I mean, enough
Mhm.
alone to constitute a genocide itself.
Okay.
So, in other words, I think that overall there was an attempt to destroy a certain group, the Bosniak group in Bosnia, and rape were definitely one of the methods employed, together with other torture, killings, brutality, humiliation, expulsion, destruction of property, and so on. But I wouldn't say that rape alone constituted genocide.
Mhm. Exactly. One of the questions that I would actually like to ask you is, now we talked about this, how these women were not helped accordingly. What, looking back, because we are now almost 30 years away from the happenings and the post-war years, What could have been done differently in order to support these women better and prepare them for a future after they have been living throughout these horrors during the war?
I think, I mean, you could have run awareness raising campaigns, just raising awareness that the women were actually survivors and heroes and should be acknowledged for what they lived through. So that kind of the attempt to hide by many women personally what happened to them wasn't as pronounced. They were considered veterans of the war, but the financial support they got was minimal. Now, all the veterans got minimal support, but maybe this category of survivors should have gotten more. Then, of course, psychological, psychiatric help, maybe help to find employment. But all these things were very difficult in Bosnia. I mean, Bosnia is not a rich country, and right after the war, it was even poorer than now. So these are things that can be done in Western countries, but which would were very difficult to do in Bosnia. And I also think that the churches could have also tried, I mean, the religious communities could have tried to take away the stigma and like to tell their believers that they should support the women and not in any way blame them for what happened or consider them now impure or bad or anything.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. One of the first rapes that took place was actually in Croatia. Have they dealt with it better than the case was in Bosnia? Because they also have a lot of victims in the early 91, 92, where there was an aggression in Croatia as well.
I'm not sure because I focused on Bosnia and actually never compared the situations and the support that survivors received afterwards.
What has the global community, what is the lessons learned from Bosnia? Now we have a conflict in Russia, in Ukraine against Russia. What are the learnings from Bosnia that could be taken here in regards of the mass rape and sexual violence that took place during the war?
I think that there is a realization that this is kind of not something unavoidable and kind of a gentleman's mishap that happens in war. Oh, in all war, men raped. That's kind of normal. I think there's an awareness now that this is a crime, should be prosecuted as a crime, and people look at it differently than they did before Bosnia. So I think that has been achieved, but we still have to go a long way until rape doesn't happen, because in each conflict that happens, that occurs, it happens again. So the actual perpetrators have not learned lessons.
Unfortunately, no. And what would your advice be as someone who has been in the heart of the war zone to other journalists today that would like to follow your path and do reporting on topics like yours or similar to the ones that you have been covering in Bosnia?
I mean, I think it is always a good thing to do, just to keep the awareness awake. But it's also a good thing to look at women in war in general, because aside from the sexual violence that they might experience, they are a special group. I mean, very often they are called on to support the war effort. They are also the ones who lose their own support network if like their husband goes away and is killed. They are the ones who take care of children, so they have a huge burden to carry in war, which is different from that of men. So that should be acknowledged. I mean, war, I mean, the victims of war is, of course, everybody who experienced it, but the experience of women is specific compared to that of men. Men, of course, they are mobilized and have to fight, which is a different story and can be also horrible. But women very often have to carry kind of the burden of war and suffer the losses of war.
Yes, yes, truly. It's a burden for everyone involved. Um, I don't know if we come back to your book. I don't know if this book has ever been translated into Bosnian, Croatian, or Serbian language. But we from our association really liked it so much that we have reached out to, I think it was Nebraska Press, in
Mm-hmm.
order to initiate the purchase of the rights so that we can
Yeah,
translate it and publish it in the Bosnian
yeah,
language in 24. So I'm really thankful that you made or covered these stories, which are a huge help for us learning about the happenings, not knowing, because as I mentioned before, this is a topic. This is still a taboo topic. People are not. I don't know if it's due to shame or due to the fact that I think it's shame that people are not talking too much about it.
yeah,
And I cannot say how important it is that we have such kind of materials which you provided to the
yes.
world, and we really look forward to do the translation to Bosnia
Thank
language.
you. I'm not sure about the rights because the book was originally published in Germany by another
Mhm.
publishing company. And then Nebraska Press added some us other authors to contribute, so there are added contributions. But the original rights might be with this German publisher. I can send you the names. But what I find encouraging in Bosnia is that some filmmakers have taken on this topic. You probably know about the movie Grbavica by
Yes, yes,
Jasmina
fine. Yeah,
Spanic. And then there has been a follow-up movie by Alan Muhic, who is also a child born out of rape, and who has then tried to find his parents and actually succeeded in the end. So I think these films, which are also internationally seen, also a very good way to keep the issue alive and remind people what happened, and that there are also long-term consequences suffered by now adults who were born out of rape. And keep it in the awareness of the public that this is an issue that must not be forgotten and should always be fought until one day it really becomes a complete taboo to rape a woman.
exactly. And this is the target at the end of the day. My last
Yeah.
question to you, as a journalist and author, what message or a call to action would you like to convey to our audience regarding the issue of mass rape during wartime?
I mean, during wartime, the message is that war can in no way be an excuse or justification for rape. But we also have, of course, rape in peace, which is, I think, for a woman who experiences it, it doesn't matter if it's in a war situation or in peace. It's horrible the same. And one has to acknowledge that it leaves a deep trauma in every woman and sometimes changes their personality. That women who were confident, self-confident before become withdrawn and insecure as a result of one act of violence. So we have to acknowledge the deep wounds that rape inflict more than other violence, and try to, I mean, I don't think that we'll ever be able to prevent it in full, but to reduce it to as little as possible.
Exactly. It's a scar for life, which it
Yeah.
gives a person. Thank you very much, Alexandra. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And I hope that some of your listeners will have kind of, yeah, will think about it and what they can do personally in their lives to fight rape.
Yeah, and support the victims at the end of the day,
Yeah.
because they are still among us. What is it? 20,000 was the estimate that were raped during the war in Bosnia.
Yeah, but no one knows. I mean, I think the European Union set up like a commission that looked into it, and they came up with 20,000. The government was speaking of 50,000, but it's very difficult to say. So it may have been 50,000 because, as you say, not all victims come forward, and it's very difficult in the end to estimate, to make estimates in a war situation.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And that is our final word for today. Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you all for listening
Thank
in.
you.
Wish you a
And
pleasant evening.
thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And thank you also for doing the podcast. I will now listen to the ones that you did previously because I'm very interested to hear what the British colonel and Roy Gutman had to say.
Sounds good. See you and talk to you.
Thank you.